bedding is going to trump food 1,000%. 1,000%. Like, I don't care what food plot you plant. I don't care what feed you feed. Bedding trumps food. They're spending more time. Bigger bucks are spending more time in high quality cover than they are at a food source when you can kill them.
Let's switch gears a little bit here. And I want to talk about the people who have maybe family property, maybe they own their own property, whatever the case may be, but they can do some stuff. They can really do kind of what they want on the property.
Yeah.
What's your number one there?
Number one is bedding. If you do nothing else on your property, I mean, everybody's doing food plots, everybody's doing feeders, but what hardly anybody's doing is bedding. So if you have one thing that you're going to spend your time on this year, and go ahead and start now, like I'm already doing it on some of my stuff right now. Say you had your season where your target buck was showing up at night, you just never did catch up with him. You tried every kind of food plot there is in the book, between summer plots and winter plots and feeders and every kind of feed that there is, but you just couldn't hold that deer in daylight. Well, that's your problem. You probably don't have the high quality bedding on your property to hold that deer. And the goal is you're going to put that deer in an area that he's wanting to spend his daytime in. Like, he's not moving all day long. He's getting up and feeding and laying back down, getting up and feeding, laying back down, and then eventually moving towards a destination area. And sometimes that may be after dark. But if I can make that deer spend the most amount of time on my property in this location, that's what I want to do. And then it also tells me, well, if this deer is on my property, this is most likely where he is. And so now I've got a whole entire hunt strategy built around, I know the spot that he's bedding. Like all these public land guys, like they're going and trying to find this bedding. Well, now we can create it and we can actually put it where we want. And so that completely changes the game and gives you a whole lot better hunt strategy when you're trying to hunt these mature bucks, is if you can set up the bedding, 70 yards off of your food plot with transition corridor running through the middle of it. And if you don't have it, you create it. And so, and the way we create that is we'll go through a property and, like, depending on what it is, I mean, every property is a little bit different. It sets up a little bit different, but the goal is if you've got hardwood timber and you walk in there and you can see 50, 60, 70 yards, even 100 yards through there, well, they're not bedding in that. And if they are bedding in that, it's very sporadic. You really can't pinpoint where it is. And there's really not any food in that. I mean, closed canopy timber's producing like 50 to 100 pounds of food per year. And we're in a state where there's a lot of deer. I mean, you can't feed very many deer with that kind of habitat. And so when we create these openings like this is basically like a mini clear cut. We're coming in there. There's going to be a third of the trees we're going to hinge cut. Like I said, a third. You're never going to hinge cut more than a third. We don't want to have a whole bunch of woods that's hinge cut. That's not good. Not good for timber, and it's not really great for deer. Then we'll take a third of the trees that the deer like to browse on, and we're just going to flush cut those. It's going to drop a tree down, and it's just going to create that stump sprout that we're looking for. That's what deer are feeding on a lot this time of year. I mean, you can go and cut a tree in the summertime, and it's going to start producing these little buds that deer are eating on in this time frame. And what are they doing this time of frame? They're trying to build back what they've just depleted chasing does and running around and running themselves ragged. So now we also take and kill a third of the trees. So there's a lot of trees that deer will not ever browse unless they're just starved absolutely to death. One of those is sweet gum. Very, very prevalent all over the South. Maybe you have some ash in there, but there's a lot of them. Well, we may kill about half of those ash and let about half of them stump sprout, because you don't want to overwhelm them with stump sprouts of all the same species to where they're all getting up too tall too quick. And so now we've created an area we've got the woody browse, we've got the structure, but then now we've also got like 90% canopy opening here, so it's like full sunlight. Now we're going to get that flush of grasses and blackberries and smilax and all these things that our deer are going to be browsing on throughout the whole entire year. I don't care if you're in ag country or if you're in like completely timber country, deer are feeding on woody browse 60% of the time, all the time. So like we've got to start creating that on the property. Now, when you've got that created, it doesn't have to be a huge size. Like a 2-acre size bedding cut is about as big as we'll prescribe. Now, if you're like a really, really small property, we may make that just slightly larger, or we may make a couple of them closer together than we normally would, just to kind of give, more opportunity to stack deer in. But on a larger property, they're not going to be super close together. We're going to have we really want to spread those out, maybe 100 or 200 yards away from each other, to where now we can sort of slip in and get between the two. And that's the corridor that I want to set up and be able to bow hunt.
I've got so many questions on this.
Yep, me too.
This is why, I've told Andrew the last couple of weeks, I'm trying to save some money now to buy some property.
Yeah.
And it's because of stuff like this. It gets me so fired up. It's the way I look at it is kind of what you're doing is like the guy who's a crappie fisherman that goes saves Christmas trees and drops them in strategic spots and drops his GPS pins. Like, I'm coming back and I'm making a deposit now and I'm making a withdrawal this summer. Okay. And it's like same thing with the deer hunting, but like to a much more kind of complex extent. I've got a bunch of questions on this. Number one is when you were talking about your percentage of like what you're going to flush cut versus what you're going to hinge cut, and what you're just going to kill, whether it's hack and squirt, or because flush cutting doesn't necessarily kill a tree.
No, flush cutting, it's not going to kill it.
Yeah.
Only thing that a flush cut will kill is a cedar tree or a evergreen. But any hardwood stumps is good on stump sprout.
So we're talking about like a third, like you're doing things in thirds, and I'm glad you mentioned the 2 acres in size, because when I was thinking about this, the casual person just watching or listening was like, he's talking about cutting a third of all the trees on the property.
No,
that's not the case.
No.
It's very isolated spots that you're
Right.
doing this, upwards of 2 acres in size. For a
if you don't do it half acre, it's not really going to be smaller than half acre. It's not going to be enough. And if you do it bigger than 2 acres, it makes it a little bit harder to hunt. Like, it makes it like you got almost too many trails to try to cover, so to speak. Whereas if you do it in like 2 acre size, you can hunt that. You have a lot more idea of like how to hunt around that. So you can even see off into it.
Okay. Now, also, again, one thing, because I just want to mention it early on in this part of the conversation, is for the small landowner, I'm thinking of like someone, could say like real small, like say 30 acres or less. Okay. And kind of like what you have here. But again, you got 28 acres here, you're managing right here behind the house. When you're dealing with that, and I'm going to look at more hardwood / pine country, and you have some clear cuts on neighboring properties, how do you compete with those clear cuts from a small landowner making bedding there? Because my brother's in this circumstance with his in-laws' property.
Yeah, so you're not going to compete with that. Like, obviously, the bigger it is, the more deer are going to want to be in that. But here's the thing. Most of the neighbors, that clear cut's only going to be good for 3 to 5 years. They're not going to manage that clear cut with fire. And then maybe they do. Hopefully they do. That's, more deer around you, the better. But like, just think you're going to manage these precisely. You're going to set them back every 3 years to where you're hunting that fresh clear cut every year. Whereas the neighbor with that big giant one, it's going to stage out. Yeah, it's still going to have some deer in it, but like yours is going to be a little more attractive. And the other thing is too, theirs is great big and everything, but like, I don't know where a deer may be in a 40 acre clear cut. I know where, if I get a picture of a deer, and I did this with that deer in Tennessee this year, like I had his rut loop, I knew exactly where he's bedding. Like I would catch a picture of him at like 4:30 in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, or right around daylight time frame. I'm like, yeah, he's laying right there. And I know that I need to be in this food plot that afternoon because like that's where he's going to be heading the next day to feed. It's like he's 99% of the time, that's where he's going to want to go and be in. And so now it gives you how to access and get into it. You know how to go and hunt it. You've already got it set up. And now you're just guessing like, well, is he going to feed today or is he chasing does today? If he's feeding, if it's like early time frame or even post-rut time frame, I'm probably going to hunt the plot more often. Whereas if it's rut time frame, I'm hunting the thicket. And I'm hunting between thickets or downwind side of thickets. And like, man, they're just going to like push does into those areas. They're going to, when they get up to go look for does, they're going to run those. They're not going to be walking through the middle of those as much. They're going to be running around the edge of them, trying to cover as much ground and get from this one to that one to that one and like scattered throughout your property.
How much consideration do you give also to when you're setting up these bedding areas, basically just holding deer and keeping them away from maybe specific properties around you? The reason I ask, we had a listener reach out to us who, I'm not going to say his name because he's got a special deer on camera. It's a really, really big deer, and he looks really, really young. And he reached out, and he's like, hey, if this thing makes it 2 or 3 more years, I mean, it's probably going to be a Boone and Crockett buck.
Yeah.
He might be a Booner next year. I don't know. really good deer, and he was basically asking advice on what are some things they could do to essentially protect that deer. And I guess I told him, I was like, I think that probably bedding is going to be it. If you could strategically keep some bedding maybe towards the center of your property and keep him from walking to, like, if there's a highway next to it, like try to keep him from walking on the highway or try to keep him from going over here, over there. What are your thoughts on that?
So a deer is going to use about a 600-acre area. I mean, that's just pretty much all of them are going to use that big of an area. And you think, well, when I've only got 30 acres, so I've got no hope. But you do. The thing is like, yeah, you cannot hold a deer on 30 acres. I don't care what anybody says. There's nothing you can feed. There's nothing you can do to hold a deer on that 30 acres and it never leave. It's going to leave. Yeah, unless you put a fence up. I mean, that's really it.
Yeah.
I mean, but what you can do is you minimize the likelihood that he's spending daylight on the other properties, whereas they are going to have a chance to kill him sometimes, but they're going to have to pick the right day and all that kind of stuff, and all the stars align. Whereas if I can stack in the most amount of bedding and thick stuff that's going to be really good, high quality stuff on my property, then I've got a lot better chance of killing him even before the rut ever gets there. And you have all that bedding close to a really good food source. You put all the pieces in play, like you may kill that deer before the rut ever comes. You're just never going to be able to keep them off of the neighbors. And like, I lose deer. I still lose 3 and 4 year old deer that, like, man, I was really banking on that deer making it. Well, that just means I need to do a little more work. You just have to set it up that way and maybe talk to your neighbors and like, hey, look, we're trying to manage for 5.5 year old deer. This is the capability that we have. Like, I would really like to work with you, not against you. Maybe they do some of the same work. Or maybe you just don't tell them nothing and you hope. But like, bedding is going to trump food 1,000%. 1,000%. Like, I don't care what food plot you plant. I don't care what feed you feed. Bedding trumps food. They're spending more time. Bigger bucks are spending more time in high quality cover than they are at a food source when you can kill them.
So going back to the whole idea of food plots and staging and bedding cover, when it comes to a property architecture standpoint, in a perfect world, let's say you got that deer, like you got this up-and-comer, just superstar, and you want to keep him on your property and you're starting from scratch, and he's already using your property, would it make sense to basically try to put high-quality bedding towards the middle of the property and then kind of stagger out maybe food from there so he has a really high-quality food source to stop on your property? So maybe he hits that food plot on your place before dark, but he's not leaving your property. Whenever he is spending time on your property, he's not getting off until after dark.
No, that's exactly what I try to do. Not every property sets up the same. It just depends. Majority of the time, I want to set up my property to where I'm accessing my property line and blowing my wind on my neighbor and keeping the center of my property as safe and secure as possible. Like, why would I want to go and blow out something on me and, that part of my property is not safe and secure? The neighbor's property is, or I'm accessing through my property and blowing out what bedding or thickets or anything that I have. So like, sometimes, very rarely, but sometimes I actually set up a property the opposite where you actually have the best chance coming in through the middle of the property and catching deer coming back to bed on you. So like, it really just depends on how the property lays. Like I said, you're trying to use, setting the property up with a northwest or a southeast. And if you can, put a perimeter all the way around your property and only access that.
So like kind of like a fire break or a
fire
ATV
break.
Trail.
Anything, yeah.
Well,
yeah.
So our family farm, Anthony's farm that you've been out to, you and Kyle Liebarger, that's an interesting example of you can come in from the property line, but every access point's from the north on that place. You can't come in from the south, big landowner right there all the way around it. Is there a situation like that where you can almost create some kind of negative terrain through the center of that property just for an access standpoint where it has a lower likelihood of deer walking right through the center of it or bedding right in the center of it?
And then you can think about there's certain days where you can do that. So if you've got a property that sets up like that where you can't get that access for different winds, if you think about like an early morning hunt, like for instance, like it's super cold, it's usually fairly calm on that morning, It's like a hard frost. There's really not a lot of deer activity right there early in that time frame. I will take some of those cases like that on my own properties that aren't set up perfect. I will take the wind at my back and on a very, very calm day to get to that spot and hunt that. But that's one of those things where you're doing it like on the right day, and you're not doing it very often, and because you're still going to have to come out. But like if I'm blowing out one little line on my property, I'd rather do that than blow out a whole edge of my property. So you're blowing out a small portion as opposed to half of it.
Yeah.
Basically. So yes, there's cases where I do that, but it's like you're hunting it on a strategic wind, on strategic conditions, and that's the only time you hunt it.
Setting up bedding areas on a property, how do you go about, if you're trying to be very strategic on placing them where you have either predetermined travel corridors or you're trying to make travel corridors, how does your strategy change for putting bedding areas in more of like a hill country, gentle rolling hill country versus like flat land? Like what's your thoughts on that?
So in flat land, you're just going to have transition edges. Like that's all you're going to have. So like basically if you can create where, maybe 2 or 3 come together, you might create that. But like in hill country, you can have, I like to try to hunt higher on the hills than I do down in the bottoms, especially if you're just going to have so many more deer that get downwind of you or smell you. It's very inconsistent down in the bottoms. And so we try to set up our access from the top and set up the deer just off of those points down below you and basically catch deer either crossing the downwind side, like they're going to come around those bedding thickets just above them, and you're sort of like in between them or you're in between maybe food as a pinch and the thicket as a pinch. You set up the deer to where you can stack as many in the middle, and you sort of set up. Just depends on how the property lays, man. Really, it's kind of hard to like point it out like without seeing a property, but
like would you use in hill country also like terrain as part of that travel corridor? Where
yes.
in flat land, like you don't really have terrain, like you said, it's half.
You just have to create thicker transitions, and it's like when you're trying to create those transitions, you're more like doing like a 40% canopy opening just on a 40-yard wide area through there, and not really many hinge cuts, but a few flush cuts down through there just to make this part of the woods different than that part of the woods. And so the idea is that they're going to run the thicker habitat edge as opposed to running the wide open hardwoods. So if you're creating a transition between 2 bedding thickets, that's what you would do. And then you could take, maybe you're using a little bit of terrain, or maybe you're using something, maybe it's a broad gap that they're crossing. Now we come in and say, if we're trying to break that 60-yard gap that they're crossing, we'll just take enclosed edge feather up towards your stand location to where now they'll kind of come in there and they'll loop around that edge feather, mock scrape right there. Now they're at 30 yards as opposed to possibly 60 yards. And so you sort of set that up that way.
Also, I want to clarify, because I know we're going to get questions on this. An SMZ, Stream Side Management Zone, is in pine country specifically, where you have the hardwood drainages running on the property. It's where they have to leave the trees for erosion control and all that kind of stuff. I just want to put that out there for people. Is there anything that you've ever done or looked at on properties that has SMZs on it, these hardwood drainages, where you put bedding areas either at the head of some of those drainages or anything like that, like use that edge habitat in addition to anything else around it as a point of putting a bedside at?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you'll kind of have that finger that runs through there, but then you have like little smaller fingers that kind of come up in between there. And so like those are good places to sort of stack that bedding up. And depending on how you can access it, like I do have some thermal hubs that I hunt because I can access it from, say it lays north, I can access it from the south, and I really have a lot of negative terrain to the south. And, you get down there in the afternoon and you basically just tap into the back side of it. And when you've got everything set up in front of you, then, your wind's kind of coming down and you hunt it just the same way. It's only certain days that you can hunt it. And then you can set that up that you're basically just looking down between it and they're crossing.